Between 1941 and the early summer of 1944, the Kremlin was a place of dark shadows and even darker suspicions. Joseph Stalin, a man defined by paranoia, spent 3 long years pacing his office, staring at maps of a continent where the Soviet Union was bleeding alone. To Stalin, the Grand Alliance with Churchill and Roosevelt was not a brotherhood of democratic values. It was a marriage of cold necessity. Every night, the reports from the front lines reached his desk. Millions of Soviet soldiers dead, thousands of villages burned, and 80% of the German Wehrmacht concentrated on one single, agonizing front. Stalin's skepticism was a bitter, jagged thing. Since the dark days of Operation Barbarossa, he had been demanding one thing from his Western allies: the opening of a second front in Northern Europe. He didn't want campaigns in North Africa, which he dismissed as sideshows. He didn't want the invasion of Sicily or the slow crawl up the Italian boot, which he called the soft underbelly that led nowhere. Stalin wanted a dagger to the heart of the Third Reich. He wanted the British and Americans to cross the English Channel and force Hitler to pull his divisions away from the East. In the corridors of the Kremlin, the mood was one of suppressed rage. Stalin frequently mocked Churchill's caution. He accused the British of being afraid to fight the Germans on land. To his inner circle, Molotov, Beria, and Zhukov, Stalin would often growl that the West was intentionally delaying. He believed a sinister conspiracy was at play, that London and Washington were waiting for the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany to tear each other to pieces, leaving the Western capitalists to step over the corpses and dictate the peace. Every time Churchill wrote to explain the logistical difficulties of the tides, the weather, and the landing crafts, Stalin saw it as a lie. To a man who had sacrificed entire armies to hold Moscow and Stalingrad, the technical difficulties of the English Channel seemed like a pathetic excuse. The tension reached its peak at the Tehran Conference in late 1943. There, Stalin cornered Roosevelt and Churchill, demanding a firm date for Operation Overlord. He looked them in the eye and asked, "Who will be the commander? If you don't know who will lead it, you don't intend to do it." It was only when Dwight Eisenhower was named and June 1944 was set in stone that Stalin's skepticism began to thaw, if only slightly. Yet even as the spring of 1944 arrived, the bitter doubt remained. Stalin watched the skies and the diplomatic cables. He knew that if the invasion failed, or if it was postponed again, the Soviet Union might be forced to fight all the way to Berlin alone, or worse, the alliance might collapse into a separate peace. The long wait was a test of nerves that nearly broke the coalition. Stalin was not waiting for a friend. He was waiting for a sign that his allies were willing to bleed as much as his own people had. Until the first boots hit the sand at Normandy, Stalin remained convinced that he was the only man truly fighting the war. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the sun rose over a Moscow that was exhausted but hopeful. Inside the thick walls of the Kremlin, the air was heavy with the smell of Mahorka tobacco and the quiet hum of telegraph machines. For 3 years, the Soviet leadership had lived in a state of permanent crisis, but this particular morning felt different. The intelligence reports from the Lucy spy ring and agents in London had been screaming of massive troop movements in southern England. Joseph Stalin, who often worked deep into the night and slept until noon, was already awake, pacing the Persian rugs of his office. He was waiting for a ghost that had been promised since 1942. The signal finally arrived not through a battlefield radio, but via a high-priority diplomatic cable from London. It was a message from Winston Churchill, the man Stalin had spent years accusing of cowardice and delay. The text was brief but seismic. The crossing had begun. The Great Crusade, Operation Overlord, was no longer a plan on a map. It was a wall of steel hitting the beaches of Normandy. When the news was officially brought to Stalin by his foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, the Soviet dictator did not erupt in cheers. There were no hugs or toasts of vodka. Instead, Stalin took the paper, walked to the window, and stared out at the Kremlin courtyards. His reaction was a masterclass in cold, calculated restraint. For Stalin, the success of D-Day was not just a military victory, it was a massive geopolitical shift. After years of complaining that the Red Army was pulling the wagon alone, he now had to face the reality that the Western Allies were firmly on the European continent. He immediately summoned his top generals, including Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky. The atmosphere in the room was electric. The generals saw the military relief. Every German division pinned down by Eisenhower in France was one less division the Red Army had to slaughter in Poland. But Stalin's mind was already 3 moves ahead. He reportedly told his inner circle that while the Second Front was finally opened, the race for Berlin had officially begun. He praised the scale of the operation, calling it an enterprise of the highest order, but his praise was a public mask. Privately, he was wary. If the Allies broke out of Normandy too quickly, they might reach Central Europe before the Soviet flag could be planted. By the afternoon, the Soviet press agency, TASS, began broadcasting the news to a weary Soviet public. In the factories of the Urals and the trenches of the Belarusian front, the news of the landing spread like wildfire. To the ordinary Soviet soldier, it was the greatest news of the war. It meant the end was finally in sight. But in the Kremlin, the signal triggered a different kind of energy. Stalin ordered that Operation Bagration, the massive Soviet summer offensive, be accelerated. He wanted to show the world that while the West could land on a beach, the Red Army could delete an entire German army group. The news of D-Day reaching the Kremlin marked the end of Soviet isolation. The Grand Alliance had finally put its boots where its mouth was. Stalin had his Second Front, but with it came the realization that the post-war world was being decided at that very moment. The skepticism was replaced by a frantic, competitive drive. The signal had been received, the maps were being redrawn, and the long, bloody road to Berlin was now a sprint from 2 sides.
While the eyes of the world were fixed on the hedgerows of Normandy and the bloody sands of Omaha Beach, Joseph Stalin was preparing a colossal counterstrike that would make the German disaster in France look like a mere skirmish. This was Operation Bagration, named after a Napoleonic-era prince, and it was Stalin's definitive answer to the Second Front. If the Americans and British were the hammer hitting from the west, Stalin was about to swing a 10-ton sickle from the east, aiming to decapitate the heart of the German Wehrmacht, Army Group Center. Launched on June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years to the day after Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Bagration was a masterpiece of military deception known as maskirovka. Stalin and his Stavka generals had gone to extreme lengths to trick the Germans into believing the attack would come in the south, toward Ukraine. They moved entire armies at night, maintained total radio silence, and built thousands of dummy tanks and wooden aircraft in the wrong sectors.
Hitler's generals fell for the ruse. They kept their elite panzer divisions in the south, leaving Army Group Center in Belarusia stretched thin, manned by exhausted infantry and aging reservists. When the Soviet hurricane finally broke, it was preceded by the greatest artillery barrage in human history. Thousands of Katyusha rocket launchers, nicknamed Stalin's organs, screamed across the sky, turning the German front lines into a landscape of fire and lunar craters. Stalin had amassed over 2 million men, 6,000 tanks, and 7,000 aircraft. This wasn't the desperate Red Army of 1941. This was a modern, industrialized juggernaut that had mastered the art of deep battle. The Soviet advance was so fast that it shocked even the Kremlin. In just 2 weeks, the German front disintegrated. Whole divisions were encircled and liquidated in cauldrons near Vitebsk and Bobruisk. The German 4th and 9th Armies were effectively deleted from the map. As the Red Army stormed through the marshes of Belarusia, they weren't just regaining territory, they were liberating the sites of the worst Nazi atrocities, discovering scorched villages and mass graves that fueled their vengeful momentum. Stalin watched the maps in Moscow with a grim satisfaction. For years he had been told that a second front was too difficult. Now he was showing his allies that while they fought for every inch in the bocage, the Red Army was advancing 15 to 20 miles a day, capturing hundreds of thousands of prisoners. To prove the scale of his victory to the world and to quiet any Western skeptics, Stalin ordered a parade of the vanquished. On July 17, 1944, over 57,000 German prisoners, including dozens of generals, were marched through the streets of Moscow. It was a humiliating spectacle, intended to show Roosevelt and Churchill that the Soviet Union remained the primary force breaking the back of the Nazi beast. Operation Bagration achieved something D-Day could not do alone. It forced Hitler into a two-front war of attrition that he had no hope of winning. By the time the offensive halted at the gates of Warsaw, the German army had suffered its greatest defeat in history, losing nearly 500,000 men. Stalin had sent his message loud and clear. The Second Front had begun, but the Red Army was already halfway to Berlin. The Soviet answer was not just a military operation, it was a declaration that the future of Europe would be written in Russian blood and Soviet steel. As the summer of 1944 progressed, the atmosphere in the Kremlin shifted from the relief of D-Day to a cold, calculating urgency. The maps on Stalin's desk were no longer just about survival, they were about the architecture of a new world. The Second Front had succeeded beyond expectations, and as the Western Allies broke out of Normandy and raced across France, Stalin realized that the liberation of Europe had become a race for its soul. The race for Europe was on, and every mile of territory gained by a tank was a mile of political influence for the decades to come. Stalin's primary focus was the shifting map. He watched with intense scrutiny as Eisenhower's armies liberated Paris and surged toward the Rhine. To Stalin, the speed of the Western advance was both a blessing and a threat. While it drained German reserves, it also meant that the Americans and British might reach the heart of Germany, or even Berlin, before the Red Army could secure its buffer zone in Eastern Europe. He began to issue frantic orders to his marshals, Zhukov, Konev, and Rokossovsky. The directive was clear. The Red Army must not only defeat the Wehrmacht, but must occupy as much of Poland, the Balkans, and the Baltics as possible before the inevitable peace conferences. This chapter of the war saw the birth of the Iron Curtain long before the term was ever coined. In Poland, the tension reached a breaking point during the Warsaw Uprising. As the Polish Home Army rose up against the Nazi occupiers, Stalin ordered his troops to halt on the banks of the Vistula River. He watched from across the water as the Germans crushed the Polish resistance, effectively clearing the way for a pro-Soviet government to take power later. It was a brutal piece of political chess that signaled the end of the Grand Alliance's honeymoon phase. The common enemy, Hitler, was fading, and the old ideological rivalries were resurfacing. The race also extended south. Stalin redirected massive forces into Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. He wanted to ensure that the Danube and the Balkans were under Soviet boots before any Western influence could take root. In Moscow, the percentages agreement with Churchill, written hastily on a scrap of paper, divided Europe into spheres of influence, but Stalin knew that the only reality that mattered was the presence of his soldiers. He told his inner circle, "This war is not in the past. Whoever occupies a territory also imposes on it his own social system." By late 1944, the map of Europe had been redrawn in blood. The race for Europe had transformed the continent into a giant chessboard where the prize was the future of civilization. The Western Allies were pushing from the west, and the Soviet juggernaut was crushing from the east. The gap between them was closing, but as the soldiers prepared to meet on the Elbe River, the generals and politicians were already looking at each other with suspicion. The victory over Nazism was certain, but the shifting map was creating a divide that would split the world for the next 40 years. Stalin had learned that D-Day succeeded, and his response was to make sure that when the dust settled, the shadow of the Kremlin stretched as far west as possible. By May 1945, the smoke over Berlin began to clear, revealing a city reduced to a lunar landscape of shattered brick and charred corpses. Joseph Stalin stood at the pinnacle of his power, yet the atmosphere in the Kremlin was not one of unadulterated joy. It was a bitter victory. The Soviet Union had achieved the impossible, crushing the most formidable military machine in history, but the cost was a generation of men and a nation in ruins. As the final assessments were made, Stalin realized that the success of D-Day, which he had once begged for, had created a new, perhaps more permanent obstacle to his ambitions. The scale of the Soviet sacrifice was finally coming into focus. While the Western Allies celebrated with champagne in London and New York, the Soviet Union was counting its dead. 27 million lives lost. For every American soldier who died, nearly 80 Soviet soldiers had fallen. Stalin used these numbers as a moral cudgel at the negotiating tables of Yalta and Potsdam. His final assessment was cold. The West had provided the boots and the planes, but the East had provided the blood. He believed this entitled him to a permanent sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, a security belt that would ensure Russia never suffered such an invasion again. However, the bitter victory was defined by the sudden realization that the alliance was a corpse. The moment the common enemy, Hitler, was removed from the equation, the glue that held the big three together evaporated. Stalin watched with growing resentment as the United States revealed the ultimate trump card, the atomic bomb. The success of the Western Front and the technological leap of the Manhattan Project meant that the Soviet Union's massive conventional army was no longer the undisputed master of the world. The race that had begun on the beaches of Normandy had ended in a stalemate of a different kind. In his final wartime speeches, Stalin praised the mighty coalition, but his actions told a different story. He began the systematic Sovietization of the territories his armies occupied. The liberation that D-Day had promised for the West looked very different in the East. It was the replacement of one totalitarian boot with another. Stalin's assessment was that the peace would be nothing more than an intermission before the next inevitable conflict between capitalism and communism. The Second Front had helped him win the war, but it had also brought his rivals to his doorstep. The legacy of D-Day in the Soviet narrative remained complicated. Publicly, it was acknowledged as a significant feat of arms. Privately, Stalin and his successors would downplay it for decades, emphasizing that the war was won on the Volga and the Dnieper, not the Seine. The victory was bitter because it brought no true peace, only a cold war. As the Iron Curtain descended across the heart of Europe, the maps Stalin had obsessed over were finally frozen in place. The man who had spent the war fearing he would be left alone now found himself at the head of an empire, yet more isolated and paranoid than ever. The triumph of 1945 was a graveyard of dreams, where the seeds of the next 40 years of global tension were sown in the very soil liberated by the tanks of the East and West.